Ethical and Legal Issues, Chapter 3. It is important for nurses to understand the law and the rights of the patient within their care. So, nurses are subject to complex situations every day. Ethical issues come up, and legislation determines what is right or good within our society. So, you must be aware of your obligations. So, these are some core concepts regarding ethics and bioethics, and I suggest that you do familiarize yourself with these terms. So, ethics distinguishes from right and wrong, and bioethics to help you distinguish what is ethical in the scope of medicine, nursing, or allied health. Moral behavior, conduct that results from a serious critical thinking about how individuals should be treated. Values are personal beliefs about what is important and desirable. Value clarification. So is self-exploration by people identifying and ranking their own personal values. So this behavior increases awareness about their behaviors. And right. Right is a valid, legally organized claim or entitlement. So the absolute right is when there is no restriction on the individual's entitlement, whereas a legal right is one that has been enacted by law. So let's discuss some ethical considerations. So utilitarianism is focused on the end result. So what action will produce the most good for the most amount of people? And Kantianism suggests that the decision and actions are bound by a sense of duty. Christian ethics, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Natural law theory, do good and avoid evil. And the human knowledge knows the difference between both. Ethical egoism, decisions are based on what is best for the individual making the decision. Okay, we have a question. An operating room nurse asks a psychiatric nurse, how can you work with the mentally ill day in and day out? The psychiatric nurse replies, it's just the right thing to do. The psychiatric nurse is operating from what ethical framework? So you have Kantianism, you have Christian ethics, ethical egoism, and utilitarianism. And you are correct. The answer is Kantianism. Kantianism. A. All right, we have a question. So the operating room nurse asked the psychiatric nurse, how can you work with the mentally ill day in and day out? The psychiatric nurse replies, it is just the right thing to do. The psychiatric nurse is operating from the ethical framework of Kantianism, A, B, um, Christian ethics, C, ethical egoism, and D, utilitarianism. I'll give you a second. You are correct. The answer is A. Ethical dilemma is it when a situation occurs and the individual has to make a choice between two unfavorable alternatives. And remember that taking no action is actually taking an action, or not making a decision is making a decision. So we're going to review some ethical principles. Please know your ethical principles. You likely will see them again. Autonomy. Autonomy emphasizes the right for people to determine their own destiny and assume that the individuals are capable of making choices. Beneficence. Beneficence refers to the duty to benefit the good of others. Nurses who act in the interest of their patients or clients are beneficent. So you're acting on the behalf of a patient. Advocacy, which is not on this slide. However, it should be in your text. Advocacy is acting on another's behalf either by being a support or a defender. Okay, so the patient may desire to have a certain procedure done or certain consultation, or you are then advocating for that patient. And sometimes you are advocating for something that maybe the physician or nurse practitioner does not recommend. Nevertheless, the patient does have rights to make their own decision. Now, of course, you're going to educate the patient on what is best evidence-based practice, but you as the nurse have an obligation to advocate for your patient. Okay? So you are a supporter or defender of whatever the patient wish. Non-maleficence, which is not on your slide as well, but you do need to know this term. I'll spell it for you. It's NONMALEFICENCE. Non-maleficence is the requirement that healthcare providers do no harm to their client. Some suggest that avoiding harm is more important than doing what is good. Justice. Special attention to justice. So make sure you know this one. Justice is the idea that individuals have the right to be treated equally, regardless of race, sex, marital status, diagnosis, social standing, economic level, or religious belief. Veracity. Veracity refers to the duty to be truthful. Clients have the right to know about their diagnosis and their treatment and their prognosis. So you want to be able to explain to your patient what exactly is happening to them and what are their treatment options. Sometimes you'll have family members that will say, oh, don't tell auntie about her diagnosis. It's going to make her depressed. However, you cannot be involved in that. If in fact your patient asks about their test results or their diagnosis, then you must discuss that information with them, or direct them to the provider, which is the nurse practitioner or physician, to discuss that information. But you cannot withhold information from your patient. Okay, the model for making ethical decisions. So first you have your assessment. So assessment is gathering the data. So you're gathering subjective data, whatever the patient tells you, whatever they relate to you. Then you gathering the objective data. So this is the measurable data. This is the data from your assessment, from lab tests and um, X-ray reports, any concrete data about the situation. And you want to make sure that you are evaluating your own personal values and the values of the person that is involved in this ethical dilemma. Step two is the problem identification. So you want to identify any conflict between two or more alternative actions. So, for instance, you may have someone that is rapidly losing weight, has dysphagia, difficulty swallowing, and with that said, they require a enteral feeding or a tube feeding placement, a G-tube placement, in order to sustain life and to meet their nutritional needs. However, some patients may opt for, so the alternative could be no nutritional supplements and just IV, or they'll sign a waiver and continue to eat and drink as they please and are okay if something happens to them, right? If they aspirate. However, others may opt for a tube feeding placement and they may not want to take that chance of aspiration, or they may not want to go without eating or drinking and just be hydrated through IVs, right? So these are the alternatives, the problem identification, right? And the conflict between the two alternatives. Third step is planning. Explore the benefits and consequences of each alternative. Consider principles of ethical theories. Select an alternative. Okay, so in this phase, we are deciding what are the consequences of the decision between tube feeding placement, between um, signing a waiver to eat and drink and possibly aspirating, and also um, having no PO or by mouth nutrition and just receiving supplements like hydration through IV. So, what are the ethical theories that we're um, imposing here, and what are the alternatives and any consequences or benefits, right? Implementation is the fourth one. Implementation is acting on a decision made and communicating the decision to others. So once the person decides, I want tube feeding placement, I want a G tube placed, then they're communicating that to their loved ones, they're communicating that to the medical professionals, and a decision has been made. And we are acting on that decision. So they're going to be scheduled for surgery. All the surgical precautions will be explained to them as far as the risk versus the benefits, right? And evaluating the outcome. Okay, so they had the tube feeding placed, the G tube placed, and it was uneventful, right? There's no infection, there's no copious amounts of drainage, the tube feeding is patent, they are able to receive enteral feedings. So, ethical issues in mental health and psychiatric nursing. So, patients have the right to treatment. They also have the right to refuse treatment, and they have a right to the least restrictive treatment alternative. So, when we speak about the least restrictive, um, the patient has the right to have the treatment that is most effective, but does not limit their freedom. So, minimizes any type of restraints, right? So we don't want to emphasize any chemical restraints, which are medications that will sedate someone, and we don't want to encourage any physical restraints as well, unless absolutely necessary. Legal considerations. So the Nurse Practice Act is legal parameters for professional and practical nursing in each state and defines what we can do in our scope of practice. So there's different scope of practice for a practical nurse versus a registered nurse versus a nurse practitioner or advanced practice nurse. And we have types of law. So our statutory law are those that have been enacted by legislation such as state legislator or the US Congress. Then we have our common law, which is derived from decisions that have been made in previous cases and evolved from court decisions resolving various issues. And we're continuing with law. So I have civil law. So civil law protects the private and property and rights of individuals and businesses. So under civil law, we have two different types of law. So one is tort. And a tort is a violation of a civil law in which an individual has been wronged. And then you have contracts. In a contract, actions, one person claims that the other person failed to fulfill obligation or has breached their contract. Next, we have criminal law. So criminal law provides protection from actions that are detrimental to the public health. It provides punishment to those found to have engaged in this conduct. So I do want you to know that you need to know these different laws. Okay? So you need to know about um, your civil laws, which are tort and contract, and then you also need to know about criminal law, as well as the Nurse Practice Act and our statutory and common law. So, legal issues in psychiatric and mental health nursing. So, first we have our confidentiality and rights for privacy. So, we have our HIPAA, which is the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, and it protects the confidential information of your patient. Only providers um, that are planning to treat the patient or bill for treatment are given access to the medical record. Then you have the doctrine of privilege communication. So this grants professionals the privilege under which they may refuse to reveal information and communication about their patient. So psychiatrists, attorneys, nurses, clergy, and psychologists have these privileges. Then we have a major exception to these laws, which is the duty to warn. So in the event that you feel that the client is at risk for harming themselves or harming others, this is when you have a legal obligation to prevent this harm and disclose this information, this medical information that has been obtained through your assessment. Next, we have informed consent. So, informed consent is when you are protecting the individual and you're informing them of all options that are acceptable and anything that may be non-beneficial or rejected treatment. So the nurse must ensure that the patients are have informed consent before making a medical decision. Oftentimes during surgery, the physicians are the ones obtaining the informed consent signature. Then we also have restraint and seclusion, and under that is false imprisonment. So seclusion or restraint is get discontinued at the earliest possible time. So it's only if you absolutely have to um, use these methods. However, at the earliest possible time will they be concluded. Unless the state law is more restrictive, orders for restraints and seclusion must be renewed every 4 hours for adults age 18 and older, and every 2 hours for children and adolescents aged 9 to 17, and every hour for children younger than the age of 9. An in-person evaluation must be conducted within 1 hour of initiating restraints or conclusions. Patients who are simultaneously restrained and secluded must be continuously monitored by trained staff. And false imprisonment. So it is deliberate and unauthorized confinement of a person within fixed limits by the use of verbal or physical means. Healthcare workers may be charged with false imprisonment for restraining or secluding against the wishes of the client, anyone having been admitted to the hospital voluntarily. So hospitalization. So we have voluntary admissions and involuntary commitments. So voluntary admissions, the person is signing themselves in and they may stay as long as needed for treatment. They may also sign themselves out. For involuntary commitment, the person is being committed to hospitalization, usually under court order. So we have emergency commitments, mental illness in need of treatment. We also have involuntary outpatient commitments, and a gravely disabled client may be committed. So emergency commitment should be sought when an individual displays behavior that is clearly dangerous to themselves or others. Involuntary commitment for mentally ill individuals is need for treatment may also occur. So someone is generally unable to make decisions regarding treatment, and someone is likely to harm themselves or others or not fulfill their basic needs. Involuntary outpatient commitment is a court-ordered process used to compel a person with mental illness to submit outpatient therapy. And then if a person is deemed gravely disabled, a guardian, conservatory, or committee may be appointed by the court to ensure the management of the person. Nursing liability. So you want to know these terms as well. So failure to act on a client's behalf, giving them care that is reasonable and prudent. That is considered negligence. And a nurse can be reported to the State Board of Nursing for negligence. Malpractice is the act or continuing conduct of a professional that does not meet the standard of competency and results in provable damage to the client or patient. So for malpractice, if you are doing something in your practice that is not best evidence-based practice, right? So in a court of law, they will have a legal nurse consultant that will testify to the standard of practice. And if your actions were not in accordance with the standard of practice, you may be held um, for malpractice. So, types of lawsuits in psychiatric nursing. So, we have breach of confidentiality. So, that's revealing information about a client's case. Then the nurse could be charged for that. Defamation of character includes libel and slander. So, libel is when false or malicious information is written down, and slander is when the false or malicious information is spoken. Invasion of privacy. So, invasion of privacy is when you search a client without probable cause. Assault and battery. Assault is an act that results in genuine fear. So they're fearful of a threat, right? They're fearful that you're going to touch them without their consent. Battery is the unconsented touching of another person. Harm or injury does not occur for these charges to be legitimate, right? So the person can be genuinely fearful and we can have an assault charge. And battery you can touch someone, unwanted touching, and it can be a battery charge, even though harm was not caused. The nurse can be charged with false imprisonment, which we talked about this already, so holding a person against their will. And you are correct. The answer is A. As a threat to others, the client can be restrained despite objections and voluntary commitment. We have ourselves another question. So a nurse gives a client 5 milligrams of Haldol for agitation. The client's chart was clearly stamped allergic Haldol. The client suffers anaphylactic shock and die. How would the nurse actions be labeled? A. Intentional tort. B. Negligence. C. Battery. D. Assault. And I'll give you a minute. As you see, you need to know these terms. You are correct. The answer is B. The nursing action was unreasonable and careless act. The nurse is negligent and can be held liable for the client's death. So how to avoid liability? So first, effective communication with your patient and other caregivers. So this can be accomplished by utilizing the SBART model. Second, Accurate and complete documentation in the medical record. So if you did not write it, it did not occur. So you must make sure you document all actions. Third, complying with standards of care, including those established within the profession. So you want to follow standards, ANA standards or guidelines, as well as the Nurse Practice Act for your state and your facility's policies. Fourth, knowing the client, which includes helping the client become involved in his or her care. So you always want to get the client to buy into the plan of care, and you're not imposing the plan of care, but you are explaining to them, educating them, and making sure that they are in agreement with their care plan. 5, practicing within nursing, the nurse's level of competency and scope of practice. So you want to abide by professional standards. So those are the standards given by your State Board of Nursing, the Nurse Practice Act, and ANA guidelines.